You're listening to the History Things Podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit hole of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the guys on social media by searching at the History Things Podcast. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Matt and Pat are coming right up. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome back, everyone, to the History Things Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Borders, and with me, as always, is the Rangers Ranger from Western Maryland. My co-host, you know him, he's Pat McGuire. How's it going, buddy?
It's going good. I like that one. The Rangers Ranger from Western Maryland. That's right. It's my territory. Do not come out there. You will get karate chopped. You won't get karate chopped. You'll get pleasant interpretation, but karate chopped. Matt, how you been, man? It's good to be back doing things kind of old school today. You are at the Ford Operating Base Borders for this recording. You are not in studio with me under, usual crappy car circumstances. Tell me out there, right? Who doesn't feel me on that stuff? But it's kind of neat, though. We haven't really done one of these since I think our first or second season doing this show, and heading into our sixth season. At this point, that's pretty incredible. So, Matt, I'm excited today because when we launched the show, we've said this a few times for some bigger episodes on our show. When we were back at day one, when we were back at day zero, -1, before we had ever done anything for this show, we had talked about an initial set of topics that would just be really rad to talk about here on the show. And we threw out immediately White Star Line. You heard that in season 1. We threw out the Lincoln assassination and the Booth flight, and you heard that in season 2. You heard the Somme in season 3. You've heard some big ones in season 4 that we wanted to talk about, and we're going to get to one today now in season 5 that was thrown out there on day 1. And it's a story that's more familiar to those of you who maybe are, say, from the Mitten. From the Mitten, like my co-host, who may or may not be from a sort of glove type apparatus you place on your hand when it's cold. Matt, did you grow up, before we just even get into the topic itself? Yeah. For our viewers, they're going to figure out how to orient the mittens there. For our listeners, without directly dropping the name of the episode and title yet, did you grow up with this story, Matt? As a kid, being regionally, like kind of right where it happened?
Regionally, we weren't right on the lakes, so it wasn't something that was front and center all the time, but it was definitely something we were aware of. As our guest will likely touch on, there's multiple museums that touch on this particular story, but to really get into that story, I want to introduce our guest today.
All right, well, we
have from the Shipwrecks and Seadogs podcast, Rich Napolitano is joining us today to talk about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, something we've touched on very briefly with our show, but now we're going to really dive into it.
Rich, how are you? Welcome to the History Things Podcast.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on here. I'm really excited.
We're excited to have you. We're obviously fans of your show. Again, kudos to you for putting out an Edmund Fitzgerald episode that will be obviously lake superior to this inferior podcast. See, Matt, sometimes I got lake puns. But no, we're very honored to have you as a guest storyteller on our show, being such big fans of your show as we are. Rich, this is one of the biggest shipwrecks in history. Like, when we think of shipwrecks, it seems to me that people's mind almost immediately goes towards Titanic. And if it doesn't immediately land there, it almost absolutely falls onto the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And when you compare the two, it's basically, they're both huge ships, but the wrecks themselves are entirely different. But somehow they both lodge themselves into the psyche, the general atmosphere of what we all think about collectively when we think shipwrecks. So can you tell our listeners, just before we get into, what you do with the Shipwreck podcast, just why this one grabbed you, because it grabs us for the similars, but why did that wreck grab you and say, I want to do an episode about it?
That's a great question. And probably the biggest reason I chose to cover it is because it has without a doubt been the most requested episode that I've ever had.
Wow.
And more so than the Titanic. I
Wow.
always get asked, when are you going to do Edmund Fitzgerald? And uh, obviously it's because of the notoriety it received and the fame it received from the Gordon Lightfoot song, of course, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Um, it is like if you were to make a Venn diagram of the Titanic and Edmund Fitzgerald, there would be a lot of differences. Almost everything about them is different. One was an ocean liner, one was a laker, one was a passenger ship, one was a cargo ship.
Right.
The one was in a storm, the other one wasn't. It just, the Titanic hit an
Just
iceberg, but otherwise the
yeeted
weather
onto an
was nice.
iceberg. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of differences there, but what makes them similar is that it was a tragedy, obviously, for both of them. But there are things that were learned also from the wrecks that precipitated further safety measures. So I think that's really important to consider every time there is a shipwreck. It's always evaluated. The Coast Guard has a marine casualty report. The insurance companies investigate and all of that. But there's always something to learn from them, and there's always stories behind them. And that's really why I started this podcast. Is I love history, and I love telling stories, and I really like to dig into the nuts and bolts behind the people, the places, the time period, the geography, the politics, whatever's going on at the time, because all of those things are factors.
Right.
And the Edmund Fitzgerald was an interesting one to me, not just because of the fame it received from the Gordon Lightfoot song, but because it's really become so important to so many people, especially around the Great Lakes area.
So
So
go ahead,
just
Matt. You're
just to
from the
touch
Great
on
Lakes.
that.
You're the ambassador of the Great Lakes, so you should speak on behalf of your people, Matty B.
Well, I was just going to say, touching on that point, Rich, my best friend growing up is a very accomplished artist, and he's still back up in Michigan, but he had a mural that he painted of the Edmund Fitzgerald on his bedroom wall.
Wow.
And we were just kids, but this is something that we were aware of. Again, because we weren't on the lakes growing up, it wasn't saturating us all the time, but we were very much aware of it. So much so that it even inspired art in this young guy in Southwest Michigan.
Matt, I have a question for you about this art. Like honest assessment. Is it kid art or was it like legitimately good?
No, Brent could draw, and thus he was able to paint something really well. So no, it was good stuff.
All right. So you walked in and you were like, whoa, dude, sick.
Right.
Because there's like the crayon down, like I'm thinking, because I have young kids and it's like, wow, this is really good, but it's clearly just like a crayon drawing. I just, you got to ask. So that's really cool though, to have like kind of a mural of a ship like that, obviously pre-sinking, right? So in all of its glory.
It was actually in the event. So he had the ship, the storm was going, and a big wave was coming and kind of crashing down on it.
This is intense. Are you able to find a picture of this mural?
I might be able to. Let me see what I can dig up.
All right. If Matt's able to pull that rabbit out, we'll share that with our listeners there. All right, Rich, tell our listeners who might be unfamiliar with you just about Shipwrecks and Seadogs. It's obviously more than just the Edmund Fitzgerald and things like that, but our listeners who like coming to our show for Shipwrecks might need a little bit more than we can give them. And you're the perfect show for that, being, almost exclusively about these types of stories. So tell our listeners just about your show and what you like to do and talk about on Shipwrecks and Seadogs.
Yeah, so Shipwrecks and Seadogs is primarily a maritime history podcast. That's probably the easiest way to describe it. However, I have covered episodes, everything from well-known shipwrecks like the Queen Anne's Revenge and Blackbeard, all the way to the Edmund Fitzgerald and some lesser known ones, like the let me just say that again. I'm sorry.
All right.
Some lesser known shipwrecks such as the Lulworth Hill, which was a World War II British shipwreck. That the tragedy of the survivors was really something that grabbed me, so I went ahead and did that story as well. And also, I grew up here in Florida in the Tampa Bay area, and I did an episode about the Sunshine Skyway Bridge that collapsed after it was struck by a cargo ship back in 1980, and a motorist, 36 motorists passed away when they drove off the bridge
Oh my goodness.
because it had collapsed. So it's not just shipwrecks. Sometimes I will do stories on famous navigators like Captain James Cook, pirates like Black Sam Bellamy, those kind of things. But it's all maritime related for sure. And like I said, I really like to dig into all of the factors leading up to the accidents or whatever the story might be, and give all that background, give all the details behind the people, because we don't want to forget these people. We don't want to forget what happened. So I do take it rather seriously. I don't like to make light of any of the deaths or anything like that, because it's a serious topic. Um, However, there's always some interesting stories that can be woven into a story such as a shipwreck.
Yeah.
And there's little nuggets of information I come across too, which we'll have actually in this story as well. That I come across it always pleases me when I find them. So that's how I got into it. I've always been a lover of history. I read a ton about all kinds of different history, and when I decided to do a podcast, it was because I listened to so many podcasts. I know how to do all the recording stuff. I had all the equipment already. And I said, I could do this.
Hey
And then I
man,
just
we did
thought
that
about,
too. We did
yeah.
the same thing.
I know how to do it. I'm not a master at it, but I think I'm pretty good at it. So that's really how it got started. And I just kind of took off. Going on a little over a year now.
Well, congratulations, man. The first year
Fantastic.
is the hardest, right? Matt and I can tell you, you got to intentionally decide to do it at every moment you actively think about it. You have to choose it, choose it, choose it. So good for you
Yeah.
have you hit, as of the time of this recording, have you actually hit that mark, or are you still looking at it down the road?
You mean for a year?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm past the year, so about a year and 3 months now.
All right, man. Well, congratulations on
Yeah.
getting there.
Thank you. Thanks.
I feel that in a really deep way. Like we started our podcast for very similar reasons. We like to connect to history ourselves. We like good storytelling. We thought we were pretty good at being able to interpret. Obviously, that's what we both professionally do for a living, is tell stories. But we also work in an official capacity. Sometimes we want to let our hair down. Like me especially, let my hair down. But we appreciate the professional approach, the acknowledgement of the seriousness of what you're talking about. Sometimes on our show, we have to directly acknowledge that Matt and I have to live in gallows humor land sometimes, because some of the subjects we've talked about have been so grim that it's like, I am interpreting it. Like I can't personally live this for the next 5 days. I have to go about my life that I am fortunate enough to be able to live, type of thing. So respect to you for being aware of that at all times in production. I am excited, Matt. 5 years in the making to get into this story, and we're here. It's time. Cue the Gordon Lightfoot, because we get to play it as a nonprofit show. We get to fair use our Gordon Lightfoot for less than 60 seconds. So let's do it, and let's celebrate the Canadian master in denim, who is the reason that I got even introduced to this story. I mean, I heard the song, and after listening to it a few times with my dad, he was like, by the way, this happened. So real life happened. So I'm excited to do it. Let's get into it, Rich. When you start the story of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, like all of our listeners, I ask, you have to pick a beginning. There's obviously many places you can pick a beginning, but for you, when you're telling this story, where do you decide to start the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald?
So I would start with just talking briefly about Lake Superior, because it's a unique lake. It's the largest of the Great Lakes, and in fact, it has it could fit all the other Great Lakes inside of it, including 3 extra Lake Eries. So that's how big Lake Superior is. It actually holds 10% of all the fresh water on Earth.
Wow.
is in Lake Superior. So, I mean, that is really hard to imagine.
Can
And
I ask a
also
silly question,
geographically,
Rich? Can I ask a silly
sure.
question, Rich? Because you might have researched it, Matt. You might know it naturally. Can you drink straight out of the Great Lakes?
It's not advised anymore.
But like,
That's the
it's
correct
freshwater,
answer.
right? Like theoretically, you could.
Yeah,
It
theoretically.
is fresh water, but it's not. There's a lot of contaminants in it these days.
Unfortunately,
Man,
yes.
don't people. People. All
Now,
right.
if you had a life straw or one of those
Right.
filters you take while you're backpacking or something, that would be fine.
All right. So if you're gonna be like, oh, I got washed overboard and I get to survive on this dinghy, you have better chances in a Great Lake with a life straw because you could theoretically drink the water.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I didn't mean to derail this early, but as soon as you said it had 10% of all the drinking or fresh water, my brain was like, can you drink it? Like, can you just drink right out of it?
To Rich's point about the size, the Great Lakes would be inland seas if they were saltwater. That's
Wow.
how big they are.
I mean,
So-
I've seen them from the satellite pictures. They are obviously massive. I lived in Syracuse for a while, so we got a lot of that lake effect snow, which is like shoveling concrete. But yeah, so all right. So I didn't mean to derail you, Rich. We can get this train back on the tracks, but I just, when you said 10% of all the fresh water, my brain just got thirsty. I was like, can we drink out of the lake?
Well, your comment about the lake effect snow and being in Syracuse, that's a good segue because the geography of the Great Lakes and Lake Superior specifically makes it a kind of dangerous place when it comes to storms, especially winter storms, because you get this really super cold air from the Arctic coming down from Canada. And then you get warmer air, possibly even from as far away as the Gulf of Mexico, coming up from the south. And when they meet, it creates really powerful storms, gales, as they would say on the lakes, and horrible currents, really devastating winds and waves. So that's really what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, which we'll get into here in a bit. But that's in the song "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald." Gordon Lightfoot mentions the Witch of November.
Right.
And that's exactly what this was. It was a November storm caused by these two air masses colliding and causing this horrible storm. But Lake Superior itself lends itself to these. And like I said, it's the largest of the Great Lakes, and it holds it can fit all the other Great Lakes inside of it. There's approximately 550 shipwrecks just in Lake Superior.
Wow.
And that's not all of them have even been visited. So you can imagine there's probably a certain percentage that have been undiscovered and we don't even know they're there.
Rich, your show
That's
will
quite a few
never run out of
shipwrecks.
material just from Lake Superior alone.
That's true. I could do a side podcast called The Wrecks of Superior.
Superior
awesome.
Rex. That's a good one.
Well, that's interesting considering we did the Graveyard of the Atlantic episode with the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, and they were talking about having between like 3,000 and 5,000 estimated shipwrecks lost off their coast. And we're talking, a few mile stretch of coastline there, when you consider the entirety of the coast. I know I said a few, it's dozens, if not 100 or so, but it's, considering the entire Atlantic coast, it's a small section relatively to have that many wrecks. I mean, one lake, even though it is the biggest lake, has a significant portion of that number. That's pretty wild. I didn't realize that you would find something that devastating, but it makes sense. I guess we've been sailing there for quite some time as people, and the storms have obviously been bad there. Matt, you ever get lost in a dinghy in Lake Superior?
I've been on Lake Superior. I've taken the boat from the UP up to Isle Royale before. So I've been on Lake Superior.
Did it get hairy?
Gotten quite seasick on said boat. I don't deal with the motion particularly well. I would not make a good laker.
Oh, so if I actually start a pirate crew, you're telling me you're not want for the job?
I'm gonna be sick for a few days in all likelihood.
Oh man.
You
All right,
you might need
Rich.
an impressment gang to go get him and bring
That's
him
what
on
I'm
board.
saying. No, Rich, I'm gonna have to hire the press gang for sure. So all right. We have talked about Lake Superior. We have talked about these storms. How do we get into the ship itself? Now, like if I remember correctly from your episode, the ship is like 20 something years old by the time it goes down. Like it's not like it's a brand new ship, like the Titanic was, super brand new. This is a ship that's been, it's had like a pretty successful career. So tell us about the Edmund Fitzgerald. I want to say herself because I know how we talk about ships, but it's like it's clearly got a dude's name.
It is a she, even though it has a man's name.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing about Great Lakes shipping in general during that period was after World War II, once all of the industry got geared more back toward consumer goods here domestically rather than building bombs and tanks and planes and things, shipping and consumer goods really ratcheted up quite a bit. So there was a demand for these cargo ships. So Northwestern Mutual Insurance Company, which Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, I should say, decided they were going to build this ship. It was an investment for them. They weren't going to operate it themselves. So in 1957 is when it was built, or it was when it was begun to be built at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in Ecorse, Michigan. I hope I pronounced that right now.
Matt, I don't know.
Yeah. From what I understand now, that's a different part of the state, but from what I understand, it's E-course. Yeah.
Is that from the UP? Is that from the UP?
E-course.
There's only two parts of the state, Matt. There's the UP, and then there's the rest.
I haven't been to E-course. I'm trying to remember where it's at.
Aren't you like one of the troll people from below the bridge?
I am definitely a troll. No, excuse me. E-course is down south of Detroit. It's along the Detroit River.
Rich, in 5 years, this is the most love Michigan has ever gotten on our show. So I'm leaning into it so Matt can have it, because we have talked about Maryland quite a bit. We quite literally have real estate in Maine at this point because of our producer, Parker. He just won't stop talking about it. You said Black Sam Bellamy earlier, and he's got ties to Maine, and we had to shoo Parker out of this room to get him. So built at a time when we're sort of coming back to us and not the war machine here in the United States. Is that a fair assessment of the era we're in?
Yes, very industrial era, and Great Lakes shipping was really booming at this point. So they built this huge cargo freighter, and it was designed to transport taconite pellets. Now, taconite is a form of iron ore, kind of an unrefined iron ore pellet that came from mines in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And they were transporting them back east to Michigan and Ohio through Detroit and Toledo. So this ship was going to be operated by another company, the Ogilvy Norton Company. So Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance wasn't actually operating the ship itself. It was leased out as an investment. But it was a really big ship. For that time, it could carry 26,000 tons, which was a massive ship by the terms of that time. It was over 13,000 gross tons, 75 feet wide, 729 feet long.
Damn.
So it was the biggest ship on the Great Lakes all the way up through 1971. And in fact, when they ordered it to be built, the Sulaks and the St. Lawrence Seaway had just been finished. So they ordered this ship, the Edmund Fitzgerald, to be built within a foot of the limit to still be able to pass through the Sulaks. So, I mean, if you think about that, this massive ship, you have 1 foot of leeway. And as we'll see, sometimes that caused a problem.
But like, why? Why leave yourself that little room for error? Like, having used to measure things professionally for a living, like, why? Like, that is such a small window of error space.
Because every inch of cargo is more money. That's why.
Yep.
The
right,
bigger
look.
the ship, the more cargo they can carry.
All right, I understand that language. That makes perfect sense.
It may not be a great reason, but that is the reason.
I mean, you better have some
Definitely the
shrewd
reason, though.
sailors. So, all right. So they're building this ship to push the limits of the moment it's in. It sounds like maybe not so much for performance, maybe not so much for glory, but definitely for the pocketbook. It sounds like.
Yeah, and you know, actually, it really achieved a lot of fame in the area. It was a favorite site for spectators to see this huge ship going by. Now, ironically, it wasn't very pretty. When you think of
Okay.
some of the ships that, you know, the ocean liners and these majestic ships, the Edmund Fitzgerald was very utilitarian. It had a really large pilot house in the front, and just the bulk of its length was just flat where the cargo holds were. It had 3 cargo holds that they loaded through 21 watertight hatches, and then in the back there was the engines, and it was painted a brick red, kind of a dark rusty brick red color. So it really wasn't a pretty ship by any means, but it actually was very powerful. For a ship that size, it could go up to 17 knots,
Wow.
which is pretty good.
Fully loaded?
7,500 horsepower engine.
Fully loaded 17
Uh,
knots.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So what she really lacked in beauty, she made up for, because it was a very powerful ship and actually quite fast for her size. So the ship is built, and it was named after Edmund Fitzgerald, Mr. Edmund B. Fitzgerald, chairman of the board of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. Now, interesting thing about him, this is one of those little nuggets of info that just pleased me when I found out. He later became a co-founder of the Milwaukee Brewers baseball team.
Oh, hey, yo.
So
I'm a
hey,
big
you know,
baseball guy, so that's pretty neat to know.
I am too. Yeah,
Rich, well, first of all, who do you root for being down in Tampa?
Rays, Tampa Bay
Okay.
Rays, baby.
I mean, that's not a ridiculous question for people out there who
No,
might not understand why. Because I'm a New York Yankees fan, and Tampa is basically part of the Yankees realm.
oh, we have so many Yankee fans here. It's sickening.
The
Red
minor
Sox
league
too.
complex down there is basically on par with half of the major league stadiums that are down
Yeah,
there.
Steinbrenner Field over in Tampa. That's where the
Yeah,
Yankees train, and
yeah,
the single A team, the Tampa Yankees, play there. That's a beautiful ballpark. The whole
yeah.
complex, it's gorgeous. It really is.
So going back to Edmund Fitzgerald, because I could talk baseball all day, even though my
And
team,
he
the
will.
Yankees. Well, listen, I might want to talk less about it because I'm a Yankee fan, and things have been absolutely dreadful for me. By the time this episode's out, the 2024 season hasn't been played yet. Who knows? By the time this is out, we could be celebrating a Yankees World Series championship. Let's go. I doubt it, though. I highly freaking doubt it. But let's go back to Edmund Fitzgerald himself, because the ship carries his name. And my understanding, Rich, of maritime tradition is that you don't put a dude's name on a ship. It's kind of like guitars being named Lucille, like BB King and all these other greats that kind of set the standard. I follow that. None of the guitars on the other side of this wall, if they have names, have like Mike. So how do we end up on Edmund Fitzgerald for a ship?
Well, there are a lot of superstitions, and mariners have a lot of superstitions.
Right.
For every superstition there is, if you followed all of them, then ships would never be named anything, because there's always something. But they named it after him. The board of directors of the company named it after him. He didn't want it to be named after him. He suggested names like the Centennial, the Milwaukee, the Northwestern, but the board of directors voted unanimously, and he actually abstained from voting. He didn't vote at all, but they voted unanimously to name it after him. So that's how it became named after him. Now, there is a superstition about naming a ship after a living person, that it's bad luck.
Right.
There's also, it's bad luck to name a ship starting with the letter A. It's bad luck to name a ship after, all these different rules. So, they have to name it something.
Why
But
not?
he actually didn't want it to be named after him.
So, why did they like? Is he just a super cool person? I mean, it sounds like he's like, no, don't do this, and the board's like, no, no, we love you. Like, is he just that cool?
I can't really speak too much about his character, but maybe they were all a bunch of suck ups. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's corporate life. And I forgot what my second question was. It doesn't really matter. I just was wondering, it's like, how do you, I mean, it sounds like when the boss is like, no, don't do this, you should listen. But they were like, no, man, no, you should do it. We're gonna name the ship right after you. You'll love it. That's what it was. If I was a sailor, why would you not just, be as paranoid as possible? It's probably your best chance to stay alive in the most unpredictable environment. Oh, this ghost. Right. Oh, the beast. Oh, the mermaid. Oh, the westward wind. Oh, the living person with an A name. Like, you named this boat Adam. Damn you, Adam is right here. It's an A and he's alive. Like,
healthy fear keeps you alive for sure.
Yeah. I mean, sailing is scary now with all the modern technologies we have. When you live and or frequent coastal areas, you realize how many people get lost at sea. Having ties to the Outer Banks, it's pretty regular to see, boats missing, sailor missing. The Coast Guard, which will be a part of this story. Obviously, the Coast Guard off Hatteras is very active, not just in the summer months, but year round. So, I think I would live with a healthy dose of whatever the mermaid told me. I will listen because I want to get back to port. Listen, Matt, listen to the mermaids. Anyway.
Until they draw you into the rocks and founder your ship.
That's right. That's true. So, all right.
It's funny you mentioned mermaids because I was a guest on another, on a Twitter live before it was called X. And the guy had asked me if I believe in mermaids. And I just kind of laughed and he said, no, I'm serious. Do you believe in mermaids? And I just said, no, I don't. And he was kind of put off because he really wanted me to talk to all the people about mermaids.
You should have dead-faced him and been like, yes, and don't ask me again.
I am on the wrong show, I think.
Look, man, I moonlight as somebody who loves to talk about aliens. So, like, I love to talk about, I guess the pirate version of that would be the mermaids in the sea. But yes, for the record, mermaids do not exist unless you're my 4-year-old and my 1-year-old upstairs. And then Ariel is very real and sweet. So, all right, just while we're talking about crazy stuff in the water, as far as the Great Lakes, either of you guys know what is like the biggest fish and or predator? Like, there's no sharks. It's freshwater and it's too cold. They can't make it there. But like, what spooky things lurk in the deep of the Great Lakes?
Maybe a gar.
All right.
Yeah, I'd say probably a gar. What always creeped me out about the lakes was just how, and Superior especially, is just how deep they are. You don't know what's down there. I mean,
is it Cthulhu? It's Cthulhu.
Yeah, it's not Cthulhu that I'm aware of.
Right.
But no, especially Superior, she's incredibly deep.
All right. Well, I just, if you're one of our, I'm not going to research it. I'll toss this one to our listeners. If you want to just free throw at me what the scariest thing living in any of the Great Lakes is, I would love to hear about that. Maybe it'll be featured on another podcast that talks about weird stuff. You're
actually talking to a Florida boy who you don't swim in the lakes in Florida because there's something that can kill you everywhere.
Well, yes, snakes, alligators,
snakes, brain-eating amoebas, you name it.
Oh, my goodness. I forgot you guys have amoebas. I mean, I know that amoebas are everything, but like brain-eating ones, if you swim in the water. We were just down recently at the Walt Disney World experience down there, and I was shocked legitimately at how just common alligators were throughout the entire like resort complex. Like everywhere I looked while we were driving between parks, you would see them in the little highway water gullies. There was a couple in the resort, just like signs everywhere. They're like, by the way, do not walk into the grass. Don't walk into the grass. Don't walk near the water. It's like, geez.
They're everywhere. They're in every lake, more or less. And you just like everywhere else, you get used to it. You have a healthy respect for them. And if you're walking your dog or your small child right on the lake's edge, you're taking a risk. You just keep your distance.
Would it be safe to say that you all feel the loss of Steve Irwin more than anybody perhaps than maybe people in the Nile that have to deal with like big crocodiles. Like, do you miss the crocodile hunter? Or what is he? He was the crocodile. Was he? I guess he's not a hunter. He's more like the wrestler and befriender.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I don't really have a whole lot of connection to Steve Irwin. I like the guy just fine, I guess, but I didn't really.
Rich has his own cadre of characters down there in Florida who deal
Listen,
with
Rich,
alligators.
you're gonna find yourself staring down the beady eyes of an alligator and been like, damn, I wish I knew Steve better. I wish I respected him more. Anyway, I hope that moment never comes, friend, because that would be terrifying to be that close to an alligator.
What I find funny is the people from up north, New York or what have you, that they're walking through a park and they see an alligator and they freak out. And like, don't come near here, there's an alligator. And like, yeah, it's way over there. It's like 20 feet away.
That would be me,
like,
from Maryland, where alligators do not live.
Yeah, like this isn't close. It's 20 feet away from me. That's not really that close.
They're fast,
just don't get
bro.
any closer. Yeah, but they don't want anything to do with people. You just have to not approach them and they leave you alone.
All right, well, I'm very good at being non-approachable.
They are not actively hunting you.
Right. When they're on the lake shore, they're sunning themselves to warm up. So they don't want to expel any energy.
You said lakeshore. Are they in the Great Lakes, Matt?
No, they're not in the Great Lakes. But speaking
Small
of
lakes.
scary things in the Great Lakes, though, would be non-living. It's those friggin' storms that we already hinted at.
Yes, and I am kind of obsessed with doomsday type of storm scenarios. So, all right. So superstitions aside, the ship is named for the chairman of the board of directors. And I guess what just goes right to its launch, or does it languish after it's built, or is it just built and put right in the water?
Well, there's not much languishing, but I do have a little bit more of kind of bad omen stuff to tell you about.
Great, because that's what I wanted to get to, because its launching is also a part of this.
Right, actually, and the launch didn't go so great. Well, the launch went okay for some, but before the launch, even when it was christened, and it was christened at River Rouge, Michigan, and there was over 10,000 people watching the launch. Edmund Fitzgerald's wife, Elizabeth, was going to christen the ship. So she gets her big bottle of champagne and she says, "I christen you, the Edmund Fitzgerald, God bless you." And she takes a swing. Plonk. Didn't break. Takes another swing. Plonk. Doesn't break. So finally she gets up her strength, takes another swing, and it breaks. So hooray. The ship slides down the slip, goes into the water, and the ship is so large, it causes such a massive surge that it swamped spectators that were in some grandstands. And it caused a huge commotion, and everybody was screaming in panic. And one man actually died of a heart attack during all of the commotion, a man named Jennings Fraser. So that was not a great start, just at the launch. So what was supposed to be a happy celebration really just turned into a somber event almost immediately.
My goodness.
Yeah.
If I was like an old sailor, like I got a peg leg, I can't open one eye, and I've been around this. I've been around the seas for quite some time and the lakes. I feel like it'd be like, you can't sail this ship at all. It's got a name of an active person. Dude had a heart attack and you couldn't christen her. Don't put her in the water. Take her right back out, salvage, scrap. I feel like that's what the old sailor there would be saying right in that moment. Nope.
Well, that's not what happened. They did put it right into use. It went to sea trials only for 9 days. Everything went great. No issues. So in September of 1958, she took her maiden voyage, and her first captain was named Captain Bert Lambert, veteran captain, had been on the Great Lakes for a long time. And the ship actually went through Lake Superior, went through the Soo Locks for the first time. And she set the record for the largest load carried through the Soo Locks that same year. And after that, in 1959, she got a new captain named Newman Larson. and another experienced mariner. All these guys are very well experienced on the lakes. But it was 1966, actually. So fast forward a few years, that Captain Peter Pulser took over. Now, he was quite a character. He was known as the DJ captain because when they went through the Sioux Locks or when they went into a harbor, anywhere where there was people that were watching, and the people loved watching, they loved seeing the Edmund Fitzgerald because it was such a large ship. He would blast music day and night. And the crew didn't really love that so much because some of them were trying to sleep. But it really was entertaining for the people that would watch. There goes the Fitz, or the Big Fitz, as they called it. And when he passed through the Sioux Locks, he would come out with a bullhorn and just start giving all the details about the ship, her history, the size, and he was quite a character. And
man's interpreting the ship.
Yeah, yeah.
That's awesome.
So it really got this reputation of, oh, we got to go see the Fitz come through the locks, because it was so entertaining. So all that time, actually, the Edmund Fitzgerald was a very safe ship, didn't have any incidents, despite the bad start and the bad luck. It actually had earned a safety award for having so many trips in a row without any incidents. And her fame was really growing because it was a big ship, it was a safe ship, a profitable ship. Everybody was happy, and the people loved to see her. And she started getting other nicknames like Pride of the American Side, like you hear in the Gordon Lightfoot song, and the Mighty Fitz, the Toledo Express, the Big Fitz, all these nicknames. For a cargo ship, it's that's pretty good to be so famous already.
Did those crazy Canadians have anything to match our great American flex?
Pride of the Canadian Side?
Yeah, sounds weak, Rich. It sounds super weak.
So to Rich's point about the Sioux Locks and folks coming out to watch, that's still something that is well loved today. In just even growing up in Michigan and doing the family field trips or vacations and things like that with my folks, when we were up in that part of the world, in that part of the state, it was very common to see crowds gathered around the locks to watch the ships go through, especially if there was a ship coming in the area. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily spend your whole day, but some folks did, especially retirees and stuff. They'll just stay out there all day and watch the ships. But we watched a couple of ships go through. It's an interesting experience, and just that oftentimes massive of a vessel going through this very narrow space to get to the various lakes it's an interesting experience, and folks still do that.
Is the custom to pump your arm like for an 18-wheeler, Matt?
That's a good question. I don't know, actually.
I don't know.
I had the chance to go to the Ballard Locks and outside of Seattle, and that was something. I've never been to the Sioux Locks, but
Sioux's cool. It's very cool. I would love
to see it someday. But I was really surprised at how interesting it was. I was like, I don't know, are we really going to have a good time? But a friend of mine said, no, you have to see it. And it was great. My wife and I spent, I don't know, several hours walking around, and there was a lot of things going on and just watching the ships go through the locks and filling up the water.
What Pat's used to is much smaller locks, because the part of Maryland
it's not the size of the lock, Matt. Jesus Christ.
We're right on or very close to the Potomac River and the C&O Canal, which has dozens of locks on it when it was in operation. So he's somewhat familiar with locks, but they're on a much smaller scale.
Yeah, I mean, as you guys were talking, I was thinking about it. It's like, I would really like to see this because I grew up along this system. Like most of my youth was spent along the canal line there. I work directly on it right now at my professional site. But again, like Matt's saying, these are small, like lock boats. I mean, they're like they're small. I mean, they're very small barges that go on the Potomac River. I would love to see just the logistical feats it took to construct the locks for these massive ships. And then I would love to see these massive ships moving within them. I mean, just seeing the sides of some of these ships in open water where they have the space is impressive enough. I've had the fortunate few times to be able to see some massive ships between Savannah Georgia, the harbor there, and in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, and just watching how precise, majestic, enormous these ships are when they have tons of space around them. And then you add in the fact that they need to be very, very delicate about how they maneuver in a lock system, especially when some of these aren't, single boat channels where like you have to maneuver while somebody's maneuvering opposite you, and you're both affecting the water. It's not like you're driving on a road that doesn't move. Like one ship displaced, another ship displaced, and it creates a math problem for both people. So, it was Matt, as you brought that up, I was actively thinking about the canal, the old canal there. Yeah. So let's talk more about this DJ Captain really quick, because he sounds like a really cool guy. And I know we're going to spend some time with McSorley, obviously, because he is the one at the helm at the end. But this is a pretty cool experience because, I like the rock and roll aspect. I don't know why, but I imagine him playing like Vietnam music, but that's probably not what's happening. I don't know why, but that's just what I heard in my head. But I enjoyed that he was like, let me tell you about the ship as an interpreter. That kind of humored me. Matt, did you chuckle? He's like, built in 1957 and 8, in Michigan, where we are now.
Well, it was such a popular ship, and he was such a character that a lot of people wanted to be on the Edmund Fitzgerald and go with them on their voyages. It had 2 really nice staterooms for VIPs.
Really?
For a cargo ship. Yeah, it was this beautifully appointed dining room, drapes, curtains, deep pile rug, beautiful silverware and flatware. They had stewards would come out with jackets and the whole deal, gourmet food, and
I
they
had no
were
idea.
famous.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he had these. The Captain Pulsar had these once every trip. He'd have a candlelight dinner for the VIPs.
Were the stewards just like those salty Michigan fishermen, but wearing nice jackets?
Yes.
It's exactly how I imagine it. I bet that.
Yeah, they just they cleaned up the oiler from the engine room and put a jacket on him.
So you still smell like engine grease. He's like, I know. Yeah. It's in my bones.
Yeah. He's like, I hate this, sir. He's like, oh, I know.
A little bit of a mystery that came out of this too was they were famous for serving something called clam digger punch. It was that something that the Edmund Fitzgerald served. It wasn't actually made of clams. It was some kind of alcohol drink, but I really tried to find the recipe for it. I searched and searched. I couldn't find it, but I imagine it was probably something pretty simple, like just Kool-Aid and vodka or something.
Rich, I will tell you this. We just did last season on our show. We did our first attempt and likely only attempt at doing a interpretive cooking show. But I will promise you this, friend, if you come across the clam digger punch recipe, you are invited back onto the show for us to make it together and share a toast to these 29 fine men. But I would love to know what this was actually made out of. Kool-Aid and vodka sounds like college, and I don't want to think about that anymore.
I will see if I can find it. I'm sure somebody knows.
Well, if you do, Rich, come on back and we'll do a YouTube special where we make some. Matt, I know cooking wasn't the most comfortable you've ever been, but are you down to make some clam digger punch potentially?
Sure, absolutely.
Matt, don't act like Matt's going to be hanging from the chandelier 2 drinks in. I'm going to sail the ship. So, all right. So how long is the DJ? What's his name? I've forgotten his name already. I apologize.
Captain Peter Pulsar.
How long is Captain Pulsar at the helm of the Fitzgerald?
Until 1972.
So he's there for quite some time.
Yeah. So the Fitz continued on, and we alluded to this earlier, but you remember when I said it was built within a foot of the maximum size to fit through the locks. It actually did slam into the locks, the wall at Sulak twice. Well, and caused a little bit of damage. And so I imagine it was something more than just a gentle little bump. And then she also collided with another ship in 1970 and had to be repaired. So it become damaged 3 or 4 times within just a year from 1969 to 1970, but never to the point where it was anything that made her questionable as far as being seaworthy. Just some minor bumps and bruises.
You said 1970, it runs into another ship. Captain Pulsar's out there like, who's driving this thing?
Yeah.
He's like,
Wasn't my
oops,
fault.
oops. Yeah. He's talking to his little microphone.
Yeah. But in 71 and December 71 into January of 72, it actually converted from coal to oil. And that was done at a shipyard in Duluth, Minnesota. And it was also fitted with some automated boiler controls, which it didn't have. So it was starting to get a little bit more high tech for that time. So that's when Captain Ernest McSorley came on board in 1972. And he was a 40-year veteran of the Great Lakes, and very well respected. He had been captain of nine ships previously, and he had a reputation of just being a consummate professional, no nonsense kind of guy. Although he did treat his crew very well, he treated them with respect. He wasn't someone that was just going to shout everybody down, but he was kind of a stubborn guy, when push came to shove.
Is that part of his personality going to be part of the play out of the Fitzgerald? Just wondering, just a little foreshadowing, or do I read into that too much?
That's a great question. Some people may have that opinion. I don't think it's widely seen that way, though, although you could make an argument for it. There were just so many things going on at the time, and we'll get to it, that I personally don't ascribe any fault to Captain McSorley, just because of the situation he was in. I don't know what else he could have done. Sure. But yeah, we'll talk about that. But that is a good question.
With him being a 40-year veteran of the lakes, was this going to be his swan song? Was he looking at retirement or anything like that? I mean, he's got arguably, if not the biggest at that point, one of the biggest and the most famous vessel on the lakes now. Is he planning to kind of move into retirement with this ship?
Also a great question. Yes, actually, this was going to be his final season. So this particular voyage was not going to be his last, but it was already November, so they weren't going to do a whole lot more, maybe just through the end of November, and that would be it for the winter. So yeah, he had promised his wife that this would be his last season and he was going to retire. Yeah.
Dagger.
Yeah. That's really
Why does it always happen like that? It's always like, I'm going to retire. I promise you, honey, this will be my last season on the lakes. Because that's how he talks, obviously. It's not. I shouldn't do that. But why does history always give us this irony? This will be it. I promise. And then the worst, like literally the worst possible outcome. That sucks.
Yeah, it's really a shame that happened. Because he spent his whole life on the lakes and had seen everything. There wasn't anything that surprised him anymore. But on that last voyage, it caught up with him for sure.
I wonder if there's part of the old sailors, though, that are like, this is how it's always going to be. This is how it was always meant to be, or whatever. Like, I'm not a sailor personally, but I know that they are so connected to the water that, like, I wonder if you've spent a life on it, you're like, at some point, I'm either going to get off it forever or it'll take me. Maybe one day we'll study the people of this ship more directly and their families and figure out if that's accurate or just me doing the thing I do on this show where I think out loud. So when McSorley takes over, it sounds like this is a guy who knows what he's doing. And so he'll get right to work, I imagine, carrying, heavy loads, things like that. Does he encounter adversity early in his time on Fitzgerald, or is it relatively uneventful up until the tragedy?
There were a couple incidents, actually. In 73, he ran into the wall again at Seadogs, and actually twice again in 74. So this is 4 times now the ship had run into the Seadogs, or the walls at the Seadogs. She also lost her 12,000 pound bow anchor in the Detroit River. Outside of Belle Isle. Yeah, it was being hauled up and it just broke and fell to the bottom of the river. Not a big deal. It didn't really damage the ship as far as the hull or anything. Just kind of a strange incident where it got lost, and that anchor actually was recovered later. So really, that was really the only adversity that he had faced up until the fateful voyage in 1975.
Well, you ready to take us there, Rich? You
Yeah.
ready to get into I guess it's not just November 10th, it is also November 9th. But are you ready to get into it?
Yes. On the morning of November 9th, the ship was being loaded in at Burlington Northern Railroad in Superior, Wisconsin. It was being loaded with taconite pellets. And 8:30 a.m., normal morning, cold, but otherwise fine. The weather was fine. So it was being loaded with over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, and scheduled to take it to Zug Island, or just outside of Detroit, about a 5-day journey. So that morning, he hears the weather report that there's a storm approaching from the south, and doesn't think anything of it. He's been on the lake forever, and he's been through storms. This one's not going to be any different. It was also taking on 50,000 gallons of fuel. So as the ship is being loaded, what they have to do is make sure that it's being loaded evenly to make sure the balance of the ship is proper. So its first mate, a man by the name of Jack McCarthy, monitored it, and if there were these lights that would come on, if it was leaning to port, it would be a red light. If it was leaning to starboard, a green light would come on. And if the light was white, it meant it was properly balanced. So he sat there all morning and watched for these lights, and would radio if anything needed to be adjusted. So it's carrying all of this fuel and all of this iron ore. In addition to that, I mentioned earlier there was 21 hatches that covered the cargo holds. Each one of those was covered by a sheet of steel that weighed 7 tons. So those would be lowered into place, but all of them had to be manually clamped shut. And each one of those 7 sheets had 68 clamps. So the crew literally had to go by hand and clamp down 68 clamps for every one of those 7 sheets of steel. And that was really important, because if those cargo holds aren't watertight, the ship is in a lot of trouble. So it was a really significant job, and they really had to make sure they did it correctly. But it added a lot more weight to the ship as a result. Just think 7 sheets or 7-ton sheets of steel over 21.
Oh my goodness.
Holds. Yeah, so that's a lot.
This ship
it took 6 hours.
To get it filled up and clamped down?
Yep. It took 6 hours to load the ship. So by about 2:30 or so, they are able to launch. They leave the dock and start heading out across Lake Superior. And literally within minutes is when he hears an updated report from the National Weather Service. There's a growing storm again. He heard it before, but now they give him another one, and it says now that there's a gale warning for the southern part of Lake Superior. Still not concerned. He's doing his thing, heads out. Right around the same time, the Arthur M. Anderson was leaving port too, a little bit north of there in Minnesota, Two Harbors, Minnesota. And its captain was named Captain Bernie Cooper, and he's going to be a really important figure. So that was about 2:30 when both ships left, approximately. At 2:39 is when they received this updated report. So really just minutes after they leave. The gale warning for the whole south of the lake. So Captain Cooper spots the Edmund Fitzgerald visually and radios to the captain. And they talk, they chat, and they said, "Hey, you heard about the weather? Yeah. Why don't we travel together? We'll stay, within about 10 to 15 miles of each other. Let's stay in radio contact." So they agree, and they start heading out across the standard shipping lane, which was defined by the Lake Carriers Association, and it roughly was right across the middle of Lake Superior and then south down through the Soo Locks. The Fitz was a faster ship, so it pretty consistently stayed about 15 miles out ahead of the Arthur Anderson. Now, at the same time that the Fitzgerald was being loaded, another ship named the SS Wilfred Sykes was being loaded right next to it at the same dockyard. And it departed about 2 hours after the Edmund Fitzgerald. Now, its captain, Dudley J. Paquette, heard the radio chatter between McSorley and Cooper, and he was surprised because when they said, "Yeah, I heard about the storm, but let's just stay in the regular route," he was surprised by that because when he set out, he immediately went north. He went to the north shore of the lake to try to skirt the storm as much as possible. So that's something that I guess you could look back on and say they probably should have gone a little bit further to the north. But in hindsight, it's easy to say that in hindsight. These were two veteran captains that had seen everything and been through gales and weren't concerned.
So Rich, this other captain, he's not abandoning his haul or anything, but he's just going to take a more circuitous route and attempt to avoid the storm. So he's still trying to get the job done. He's just doing it safer.
Correct. And of course, like all shipping, when you choose the safer route, usually it's going to take longer. So
right,
you mess up your schedule. If you come in late, time is money. Exactly. Yeah. So they're trying to stay on schedule. That's a good point to make, that Cooper and McSorley are just trying to stay on schedule, get to Detroit on time. And like I said too, they had been through 40 plus years of storms on Lake Superior and weren't really concerned about it.
Were the weather reports in any way indicating that this was going to be more of a banger than normal? Because I mean, you figure these guys are making the decision to press on because of this immense experience they have. So my guess is they're taking their cues from the verbiage and tone of the report. So, because I mean, let's use a modern example, right? Sometimes our Jim Cantoris of the world go down there and they're screaming at you that this storm is nuclear Armageddon. And then other times they're like, yeah, this is a pretty bad storm, but you want to be smart about it. I have to imagine that it's got to be a pretty standard weather update, like nothing that says like avoid doing crazy veteran stuff, right? Like take this one seriously, guys. What do you think? Are there comms of the weather updates that we can actually just listen to and hear?
I have not heard those. I did not find any of the official National Weather Service broadcasts, but from all accounts, the weather reports, it wasn't that they weren't accurate, but there really wasn't any sense of urgency.
That's what I'm asking. Right.
Anything to indicate that this is going to be really bad. In fact, at this point, what was being broadcast to them was not anywhere near as bad as the storm actually turned out to be. So in the post-accident analysis, there was some talk about some of the fault being blamed on the National Weather Service for not having accurate reports. Of course, it's easy to yell at the weather guy after you know what the weather is.
Yeah.
So, but no, they didn't know that the storm was going to be this bad.
It's a good thought, and it just makes you wonder, because you take note of the third captain in our story, kind of, is this a real-time remark? Like he notes this in like a logbook, like, that they pressed on, I'm going to do this. Or is this an after the fact, like a hindsight take on the moment?
His comments were in hindsight.
All right. So take that with a grain of salt then, right? Because, it's easy to say that at that point. I mean, obviously you can track the legitimate decision to circuit the storm as much as possible, but like how much he actively thought, that was strange that those men pressed on.
Well, ironically, though, that is ultimately what McSorley and Cooper did.
Right.
because later that night, we're still on the 9th, 7 p.m., they got another update from the National Weather Service. And this time they were issuing a gale warning for the entire lake and reporting winds up to about 50 knots, at least at this point, and waves about up to 15 feet. So that's a considerable storm.
Oh yeah.
So at this point, McSorley and Cooper talk again. They get on the radio and they say, maybe we should veer north. So they do. They head north. The Fitzgerald goes a little bit further north than the Arthur M. Anderson does. It goes up toward just off of Isle Royal that actually Matt had mentioned earlier by about 1 a.m. on November 10th. So now we're on November 10th, early morning hours. They veer north to get closer to the Canadian shore, hoping to get a little bit of lee from the a little bit of lee, which is to reduce the wind effect on them. So they do that, and then at this point, the Anderson actually gets out a little bit in front of the Fitzgerald because it took a slightly different route. And the Fitzgerald actually radios to the Arthur M. Anderson and says, I'm trying to get some lee from Isle Royal. You're walking away from us anyway. I can't stay with you. So in other words, he was trying to get some protection from the wind, and at the route he was taking, he wasn't able to keep up with the Anderson, but they were still in radio contact. So basically McSorley was saying, just go ahead, I'll catch up, or I'll be right behind you.
Can they see each other? Do they have visual confirmation on each other at this point?
Not the entire time. As long as they're within about 15 miles or so, maybe up to 20 miles, depending on visibility, they could see each other. But the weather was starting to get bad at this point. So visibility was down. But they were in radio contact and they had radar.
Okay.
So they absolutely were in radar contact with each other at the very least.
All right. Is it now what kind of storm or conditions are we experiencing here? Is this just wind and surf, like, tremendous waves, or are we getting rain, snow, thunder, and lightning? I mean, these are, things that occur in these major maritime storms. I imagine snow being a part of this, considering the time of year and the geography. Are these guys getting pummeled with precipitation in addition to wind and surf?
At this point in time, they're getting up to 60-mile-an-hour winds and 15-foot waves and rain.
All right.
It's not yet snowing, but it would start snowing. It would start snowing just a little bit later.
All right.
But not yet. But the winds and waves are their biggest enemies at this point. Now, as they start, they're about dead center of the lake at this point. A little bit north, but dead center. So they're heading east. They're traveling from west to east, and as they continue east, they get to a point where the Fitzgerald once again passes the Arthur M. Anderson, because it is a faster ship. And this is about 3 a.m. At this point, the storm passed directly over top of them, and the winds actually died down for a little bit, just like it would in like the eye of a hurricane. So they start to get a little hopeful, but what happened was the wind started changing direction. First, it was from the northeast, then the south, then the northwest. So it really just created these swirling conditions and really treacherous currents. And then again, the storm got worse after the center passed.
Is the construct of these storms similar to a hurricane? Like, are they circular, like cyclonic storm systems, or are these more like sheets and bands of extreme weather?
They're more like bands. They're not like a tropical system. But when, like I was saying earlier, when those northern air currents meet the warmer southern air currents, they do clash, and they do kind of swirl around.
Okay.
But it's not like an eye of a storm that's rotating counterclockwise like a hurricane.
It's just kind of like a void of weather for a moment, I guess. Yeah. Okay. All right. Just wondering.
Good question. I am not a meteorologist, but that's my understanding of.
Hey, we all slept on a Holiday Inn Express last night. Okay, we can be whatever we want to be for a living. Right. All right, it just it made me wonder, because when these guys, a similar experience. Let's see. What is my brain trying to say? Going to another storm. I guess maybe it was a hurricane, but the Andrea Gale, which was famously lost off the New England and Canadian coast in 90, I guess in the early 90s. It's the one that made the perfect storm out of with George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg. There was a moment where they were, I guess, in the center of a storm. I don't know if it was an eye or what type, but there was a moment of like the wind chilled out and they were able to catch their breath and kind of reassess. Is that where McSorley and the Fitzgerald are right now when it kind of dies down for a minute? Are they able to, does the surf go? Like, is it just the wind chill?
It was brief, but everything just kind of calmed down for a little bit when the storm passed right over top of them. And that's how it was described. Captain Cooper kept a pretty good logbook of all this, because as you're listening to the story, you know, if you're listening to me telling it, or if you're reading a book about it, you know, you might wonder, well, how do we know any of this? Because everybody on the Arthur M. Anderson survived. So we have their logs, we have their testimony, and then once they get further down the road, we have witnesses and from the Coast Guard and their radio broadcasts as well.
Excellent. So no decision made when things start to turn for the worse again. There's no decision made to dramatically alter the plan, or does McSorley and Cooper decide, you know, she's kicked hard enough, we're gonna take the punches and go? Because again, I can't call them old salts because they're Lakers, but you know, it's that similar. You know, we've been doing this for a long time. Like, that all you got? They're all kind of like Lieutenant Dan in the topsail screaming at the storm, right? You know, I don't. Yeah. That's not inaccurate. That's more what I'm saying is, are these guys going, well, this sucks, but we've seen it.
I think that's probably about what they were thinking. Yeah. Well, these conditions are awful. We're doing the best we can, but we got to keep going.
All right.
They never considered stopping, as far as I'm aware. That conversation never happened. So they're just continuing to go. They're in radio contact. Their radars are working. So far everything's fine. They're not in any danger. But the weather is really worsening quickly. So much so, actually, that just a little bit later, they start to see even faster winds and even stronger waves. So the ships are really starting to take a beating at this point. All throughout the morning, and now we're on November 10th, of course, the morning and into the afternoon, they're just struggling. They're heading east, starting to turn southeast down the coast of Lake Superior. They're struggling because the wind and the waves and the currents are strong, but they're determined to get down to Whitefish Bay, where the entrance to the Sulaks is located. And at one point, and this is kind of a critical point that is a little bit controversial, Captain Cooper makes visual contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald, and he's watching the Fitzgerald pass by a small island named Caribou Island. Now, the reason that's significant is because just north of Caribou Island, there's a well-known shoal called 6 Fathom Shoal, and it's on the charts, and it's known to be, you know, very shallow, very dangerous. And he actually makes a comment, Captain Cooper does, because he sees the Fitzgerald go right for it. The Fitzgerald cut a little bit further west. You know, if you kind of picture the geography, they're heading southeast down Lake Superior. The Fitzgerald cuts, you know, veers right, or would be west, just a little bit further than Captain Cooper was comfortable doing, because he passed right over this shoal. And he actually makes a comment to his crew that he is going way too close to the shoal for my taste. And he was worried. He was worried that they were going to bottom out and rip open the hull. In fact, another historian later said that Captain Cooper and his officers just sat there and watched the Fitzgerald pass right over top of the shoal, almost in disbelief. And they still had him on radar, though, so they knew once they passed the shoal, they made it. They didn't sink. They didn't rip open their hull. as far as they knew. They did actually make it past the shoal. By this time, it was 3:20 in the afternoon, and the winds were up to about 50 miles an hour at this point. And Captain McSorley decides he's going to contact the Anderson because he's having some problems now. Now, keep in mind, this is right after going over that shoal. Now, they're not sinking, but he is having some trouble because he says in the radio transmission, I have sustained topside damage. I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish? And the Anderson replies back, do you have your pumps going? And McSorley says yes, both of them. Now, this is significant because if he's taking on, he says he has some topside damage and a list. The only way that ship could have a list is if it was taking on water. So how'd the water get in? And this is kind of a source of controversy because there will later be accusations of the hatches weren't closed properly, or perhaps the hatches were damaged and weren't maintained properly, or possibly they sustained some other kind of hull damage and took on water. We don't know. Even with all of the analysis after the fact, we don't know. But he reports he's got a list and he's taken on water and he's got his pumps running. But it gets worse. Just a short time later, around 4:00 p.m., he radios the Anderson again and says, I've lost both radars. Can you watch me until we get to Whitefish Bay? And again, the Anderson says, yeah, we got you. So now the weather is much worse. Now it's snowing, sleeting. The winds are getting up to 100 miles per hour. 70 to 90 knots with 100-mile-an-hour gusts. And McSorley can't see. Visibility is virtually zero. Both his radars are out, and he's got a list, and he's taken on water. So he's in trouble. He radios the Coast Guard at Grand Marais on the emergency channel. And the Coast Guard tells him the beacon, the radio beacon from the Coast Guard station, and the light beacon were both inoperable at that time.
Why?
Bad news. Well, because of the storm. It had knocked out the power lines, and it was just causing a lot of trouble. So not only is he blind, he's got no light and no beacon. So he has no idea where the shore is. It's a dead reckoning at this point. Dead reckoning when you can't see is let's just say it's not good.
Oh man, the hair on me is standing up. Couple of questions, one observation. I'll start with the observation. It sounds like Cooper and his crew were like just sitting there admiring the size of the balls on McSorley as he headed for that shoal. What can you do? It just sounds like they were like, my God, yeah. And then, damn, that's some good sailing. When I want to speculate for a second, and then I want to ask a question. So when you pass over 6 Fathom Shoal and then sort of get not right on the comms, but the next set of comms talks about experiencing all this stuff that's giving you trouble and it's all above the waterline on your ship. It always leads me to the theme of our show, which is, people being people, the human factor, the human element. The ship is not having trouble, prior to this moment in the story, it seems. It's having maybe just the standard troubles, but like a list says you're taking on water, right? You're filling up the hull in a way. So what I'm trying to say is what little I know about the ocean is that as the bottom of the ocean shallows, the height of the waves increase. So when you start to pass over a place that is notoriously shallow, the waves which are in that same storm that you're in are suddenly going to grow in height tremendously. I'm not talking like 100, 200 foot waves. I'm talking just tall enough to crash down on the deck of the ship. Mm-hmm. If the human element wasn't perfect right there, those water it creates the Grand Canyon. It's the strongest force on the planet. So, of course, the inferiority of a human latching 68 per single hatch times 21. I mean, that's a lot of opportunity for the human element of the story to come in the way. So my brain is automatically thinking, if not an accident, just water strong enough to knock something loose, fault, whatever. But that's got to be what's happening. I mean, water's got to be towering over this ship. And then my question is, when he comes back, and he's in trouble now, he's saying so, and he's lost his radar, and he's contacting the Coast Guard. Is he still in shallow waters? I mean, he's past this shoal, but I mean, is he back out into where it's better for the displacement for him, or is he still riding where the wave structures might be coming in a lot taller than maybe, say, the Anderson is experiencing several miles away?
Well, he's south of the shoal by this point. When he radios and says he lost his radar, they're past the shoal. So
Okay.
He's back out into deeper water by this point.
All right.
But you bring up a good point, because, and it's all speculation.
Right.
His decision to pass right over the shoal, I don't think he would have made that decision purposely. My opinion, and it's just an opinion, is that he might have had some kind of damage prior to that. Maybe it affected his steering or something, because otherwise he would have stayed closer to the Anderson's path a little bit further to the east, but he didn't. He went right over the shoal. So it's really just my opinion / speculation that something might have been wrong before that to cause him to go over the shoal.
Sure.
And your point about the water and the shallow water producing the larger waves, that is a good point. Perhaps that did happen, and that's what took out his radar.
It's just something that popped into my head, Rich. I know that, we as historians and interpreters, storytellers, we want to be very careful about speculating. Obviously, there's a fine line between pure BS speculating and doing like a critical thought exercise. Like, you got to have a little bit more behind it than just thinking out loud, which again, sure, I do a fair amount of on this show, but just something I was thinking of because I have a little bit of experience and understanding of how, wave heights and things work, having, grown up with surfing and bodyboarding along the coast, you learn how to gauge, based on where the sandbars are, wave heights, blah, blah, blah. So I was just thinking, as they were going over this notoriously shallow area, how did that affect the wave heights around them? Because, and I know that big waves are a part of this story when you get into the what happened, a single rogue wave, the Three Sisters. I mean, these are things that happen above the waterline, happen above the deck line. So just popping in my head that maybe that's what's beginning to happen to the Edmund Fitzgerald now, is that she's getting battered from above by these towering waves.
Yeah, the waves are pretty vicious at this point. And I don't think it's wrong to speculate about these things, because they're not wild speculations. Those things are very plausible that those could have happened. We're not suggesting it was aliens or anything like that.
I hope you said that because you heard me while you were logging in, because when you were logging in, I said, I wonder if we're going to ask Rich about the alien abduction theory, but I was just kidding. But like, no, I mean, I've never heard one, but I'm sure there's some ridiculous theories out there about what happened that are not grounded in reality.
Right.
But no, it was something that hit my mind as you were describing the scene. So the Coast Guard says, you're basically out of luck, bro. You got no beacon. Good luck. I hope you don't find the shoreline the hard way. Does McSorley acknowledge this openly on the mic, or do we not know his sort of reaction to this news?
He does, actually. Yeah. About 5:00 a.m. now we're on the 11th. Captain McSorley radios the first mate on the Anderson, Morgan Clark, and he says, "Hey, check my position," because again, his radar is out. So Clark tells him he's 3.5 miles from Whitefish Point. Close, but still a safe distance. And they're not really off course. That's where they're trying to go, is Whitefish Bay. So McSorley knows he's got some problems. He's getting close, but he's having some problems. So his reaction, to your point, to the beacon and the radio, the beacon and the light being out, he reached out to another ship, the Avaforce, which was and it was upbound, so it was heading the opposite direction. So he radios the Avaforce and he says, "Hey, do you have a beacon or light?" And they say no. But a little bit later, just maybe about a half an hour later, they radio back. The Avaforce does to the Fitzgerald and says, "Hey, I have the light now. I can see the light at Whitefish Point, but I'm still not receiving the radio beacon." And McSorley says, "Ah, okay, great. I'm glad to hear that."
All right, I have an aside
And
question for you, Rich, real fast. This ship
sure,
sounds
yeah.
like it begins. This new ship sounds like it begins with the letter A. What kind of shape are they in the middle of this storm?
Well, so's the
They're
Arthur
okay.
Anderson.
So it's got two A's.
Well, we know the Arthur Anderson's alliterative A. It's not really alliterative, but we know the Arthur Anderson's getting shellacked.
Well, they're all getting shellacked.
All right.
Everything out on the lake,
All right,
but they make it. They
Okay.
don't sink. They make it. Yeah.
all right. I just I had to ask because we touched on it and it was it's relevant.
And the radar works. So I think the radars going out for the Fitzgerald was really a tough loss for them, because they're literally blind and damaged now, and so they're in the worst shape they can be in.
What's the disposition
So
of the
anyway,
crew on the Fitzgerald right now? Do you know?
what's their position?
Like, what's the disposition? Like, we've talked about McSorley a fair bit, but there's 28 other guys on this vessel. Is everybody at their post kind of doing their job, or are they starting to all kind of be like, Jesus, this is bad?
Both. They know it's bad, but they're tending to their duties the best they can. Now, there's not going to be anybody out on the deck, unless they have a death wish, but they're tending to their jobs the best they can, holding on, because they're pitching from side to side and front to back, and it's brutal. They're going way up these 30, eventually 30-foot waves at the highest crest and then plummeting down. And that's actually one of the theories of what possibly could have happened.
You're going to break your back doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
That is the worst ride to be on. Like, you think about all the galleon type rides at the amusement park. So they take you really up and they take you really down, like you're going over those waves. And like, doing that once or twice for 30 seconds, you're like, God, that was great. Yeah. Hours of it? No, thank you. No, thank
you. And they're probably going on about 24 to 36 hours of this at this point, of the really bad weather. And it's getting worse. It's gotten progressively worse. So anyway, he's talking to the Avaforce, and they say, well, we have the light now, but no beacon. And then he says again to the captain, the McSorley says again to the captain of the Avaforce, I have a bad list and I've lost both my radars. I'm taking heavy seas over the deck. And then he says, one of the worst seas I've ever been in. That tells you something right there, because he's seen a lot.
Yeah.
And the Avaforce says, well, you have 2 radars on your ship. And he says, nope, they're both gone. So, they're in trouble. And at this point, about 6 p.m., we're talking 70 to 75 knots wind, or about 80 to 85 miles an hour. It's hurricane strength, low hurricane, but hurricane strength.
Yeah.
Captain Cooper on the Anderson, in his log, registered as high as 80 knots, or about 92 miles an hour. And waves twice as high as a ship, 35 feet, or 1.5 times roughly. But the waves were crashing over his deck, crashing over the pilot house. And it actually destroyed one of the lifeboats on the Arthur M. Anderson just from one of these waves crashing onto it. So your point about waves crashing over the deck of the Fitzgerald is not out of the question. It very well could have happened. Yeah.
When it comes to their movements, when Pat and I have discussed the Edmund Fitzgerald in the past, I've speculated that she was making for Whitefish Point and the bay there to try to maybe get under cover.
Yeah, do like a port run, right?
Does that seem to be the common interpretation, Rich?
Yes. They were trying to get to Whitefish Bay because in the bay, they have some protection there from the wind and the currents.
Right.
It's still, a quagmire, but not anywhere near like it was out on the open water. So they're trying to get to Whitefish Bay, where they can hunker down, go as close up to shore as they can and anchor and try to ride it out. And that's what other ships had done too. That's what the Arthur M. Anderson is going to do. And there's a bunch of other ships there that are, like, oh, we're going to stay here for a little while just to try to get out of the storm. So you're absolutely right. That's where they were trying to get to. So as they're continuing on, it's still heading southeast. The first mate on the Anderson, Morgan Clark, he's watching that radar. He's keeping an eye on the Fitzgerald, and he starts to notice something. It's going in and out of his radar. It's there, then it disappears. Then it's there, and it disappears. And he realizes it's because the waves are so high. It's called sea return. He can't get a clear shot of radar at the ship because the high waves are blocking it periodically.
That's
so
scary.
So that tells you how high these waves were. It was completely blocking his radar from being able to pick up the Fitzgerald. Now, the Anderson spotted another ship coming inbound. This was the Nanfree. It was a saltwater vessel. So the Fitzgerald contacts the Anderson contacts the Fitzgerald again and says, "Hey, there's a ship about 10 miles in front of you. Just want you need to know because it's going to pass about a little bit to the west of you. Since the Fitzgerald doesn't know where it's going, it can't see."
Yeah.
And then he says, "Yeah, you're going to clear it, but he's passing to the west of you, so keep an eye out." And they say, "Okay," McSorley says, "Okay, great, we got it." And the Morgan Clark, the first mate on the Anderson, says, "By the way, how are you doing with your problems?" And McSorley replies, "We are holding our own." And that's it. That is the last thing you ever hear from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Those words, "We are holding our own." Just a few minutes later, they pass into a really heavy squall, and the Anderson can see them pass into the squall. But after that, they couldn't reach her on the radio or locate her on the radar. So that squall is what ultimately did her in. Now, specifically what happened, we talked a second ago about, maybe she broke her back, meaning the hull of the ship just literally cracked. Possible when it's diving down from a crest from those waves.
Yeah.
All the way down into the trough. It could have.
Yeah, Rich, I want to touch on that in a
minute.
minute, but I want to stop and go back to the fact that the way you just told that story sounded like the lake just took the ship. I mean, talk about all the superstition type stuff that we talked about at the beginning, but
yeah,
this the squall, I imagine this whiteout condition just crept over it and the ship visibly vanished into it. And it's what does they say? They wrote it into the Lightfoot song, right? Superior never gives up her dead. And
right.
It's just wondering if it's maybe it is all real. Maybe all that weird sailor superstition-y stuff, because the way you just described that, especially from the vantage point of the Anderson, it's like they just watched the lake take them.
Yeah.
And whatever happened seems to have happened quick, because the last transmission wasn't unless it was the most stoic, that's it, we're holding our own, even though we're effed real hard. Again, I don't want to put those words in their mouth, but it sounds like they were holding their own, and then suddenly, because how much time elapses between that transmission of "we're holding our own" and the next time the Anderson tries to hail the Fitzgerald?
Well, they try immediately, but they can't get them. That was about 7:25 or so p.m. And that was it. By 7:39, Captain Cooper's calling the Coast Guard saying, "Hey, we lost the Fitzgerald. We can't find her on radar." So not much time at all. Just a few minutes.
Rich, how much do you know about the construction of Fitzgerald? Because something that's in my mind right now about other large ships we've covered is with the construction of ships from the White Star Line's Olympic class or the Cunard, Mauritania, Lusitania era, there's these V wedges that are built into the centers of the ship as they're building, so that it can allow for the stress of the bend of a ship, to take these waves. And they built them into ships that are the size of Titanic and Olympic, which are comparable in footage to the Edmund Fitzgerald. I believe the Edmund Fitzgerald's just under 800 feet.
Correct.
And
yeah.
I believe Titanic topped out at just under 1,000 feet, maybe. So or maybe the same as Fitzgerald, but we're right in the ballpark. Do we know if the Edmund Fitzgerald had a similar type of like little V wedge for stress built into its hull to handle the stress of these waves?
That's a good question. I can't answer that positively, but I do know for sure that all the ships were being built with some degree of flexibility. At that particular time, it wasn't anywhere near what we do now with ships. They were much less flexible back in the 70s than they are now.
Sure.
So I can't specifically say for sure if the Edmund Fitzgerald had those or not, but it certainly had something, perhaps a slightly less effective version of that than what we have now.
Just thinking about like that can also be, as it is also speculated in the case of Titanic, is that can also become like the final nail in the coffin type of situation. Because whereas Titanic is, one of the speculations for breaking in half is it's tilting itself up and it breaks along that point just from the stress of the weight. We were just describing the experience of the ship rising and falling over the crests of these massive waves. I'm going to, just for the sake of this moment of speculation, like let's say they do have that V type of groove cut, or not cut, but built into the ship for stress. Like that's too much flexing. And it could like actually cause the ship to potentially buckle and break. And I'm trying to think if it happens as quickly as it seems to have happened from the Arthur Anderson's perspective, like there's only two really instantaneously catastrophic events I can think of. And one is just a complete breaking in half. I mean, that is almost like an instantaneous submersion, like within a minute or so, or they get rolled. I mean, they get capsized and thrown, and there's, it's not just the ship itself, it's the physical people on board inside get hurt when those things happen. Is McSorley even able to make a distress call? Things like that. So let's talk about some of the possible things that they've speculated maybe happened to the ship before we get into the aftermath and recovery. So we've talked about the potential for like a stress break. It breaks its back, rising and falling. Yeah. Can we talk about the rogue wave theory for a minute? Because as somebody who is into and terribly afraid of massive waves, that might be part of the story.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's say that the Edmund Fitzgerald was found broken in half on the lake bed. The stern section is separate from the bow section, some distance away, about 150 meters away. And there's taconite pellets and those steel hatch covers littered all over the place. So the fact that it is broken in half on the lake bottom means that it had to have broken apart at some point. Whether it broke when it hit the bottom, that's possible, but I think that two halves would be closer together.
Right.
So personally, I think it did break in half somewhere on the surface. That is one of the theories, that it dove deep bow first and couldn't handle the stress, broke her back, and sank. Some other theories that it was a rogue wave of some kind that crashed over the Anderson, made her capsize. I mean, crashed over the Fitzgerald, capsized her, then she sunk, hit the bottom, and broke in half. That's another theory. Now the rogue waves that they refer to as the Three Sisters are three waves from three different currents coming together, and it's cumulative when that happens. So they pile up on each other. In fact, just a short time before the Fitzgerald went into that squall, two really large rogue waves crashed over the Arthur M. Anderson. So much so that it just completely covered the ship, just smashed into her decks over the pilot house. Now, they weren't very far apart, about 10 miles, the Fitzgerald and the Coop and the Anderson. So those waves also could have hit the Fitzgerald. That it's very possible that happened.
The ships that we're talking about, Rich, are not small. To crash over the top of a pilot house on a ship like that has got to be nearly 100 or more feet in the air.
Well, it wasn't 100. It wasn't 100 feet, but the waves were reported on that day as high as 35 feet. So that is high enough to crash over the pilot house, and certainly enough to crash over the deck. You know, especially considering if you're plunging down into a trough, while these waves are hitting you, boy, I mean, it could just completely drown a ship.
I am getting so much anxiety right now just thinking about this. Like, if you've been listening to this show for long enough, you'll know that my two big fears in life are gray aliens and massive Hollywood style tidal waves. like the type you see in The Abyss, the type you see in the movie 2012, like, and you know, the type that you see in The Perfect Storm, right, where that little shrimping boat is trying to, you know, climb it. It's like I'm getting this horrible anxiety of looking up at a wave, because people don't realize how big these waves are when we're talking about 30 feet, you know, because most people go to the beach and when they see a huge wave, they don't realize it's like a 5-foot wave, a 7-foot wave, right? Like, because of how they measure wave heights. So like when you say it's a 35-foot wave, it is much bigger than you're thinking it is. Like, it's huge, which is why I guess maybe I didn't realize these ships aren't as tall or laden. They sit lower in the water. I didn't realize the pilot house. I just figured it would be up much higher, but maybe I'm comparing that to modern ships where these superstructures sit much higher out of the water now.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at these ships now, these, especially the cruise ships, they're getting ridiculous. The new icon of the seas it looks like a hotel, you know, like a 20-story hotel on the water. These ships weren't anywhere near that tall. But like I said, with these undulating currents, you know, when they dip down and get hit by a wave, a 35-foot wave could easily just engulf the whole ship.
Yeah.
Easily.
All right. So the ship is lost, right? The Arthur Anderson is immediately, are they calling a mayday? Like right at this moment, like pretty quick?
Yeah, they call multiple times. The first time they call is at 7:39, so just literally minutes later, and they say, "Hey, we lost radar contact on channel 6. That channel 16 is the emergency channel, and that's significant because the response from the Coast Guard was, "Hey, can you switch to channel 12? We're trying to keep this channel clear."
Sure,
kind of ridiculous.
Bro, we're having an emergency. We're using the emergency channel.
Yeah. So about 15 minutes later, 7:54, they call again. And this time he says, we have lost the Fitzgerald. We can't reach them on radio. We can't see them visually. And they're not on radar anymore. And the Coast Guard officer on duty, the reply was, keep an eye out for a 16-foot boat that's gone missing. So it's like they're just not hearing the situation. They're probably just thinking there's no way the Fitzgerald has sunk. There's just no way.
So wait, they responded to that with, I'm going to ignore that. You guys keep your eyes out. There's a 16-footer not tracking right now.
That is correct. In fact, the Coast Guard officer said later, I considered it serious, but not, I'm sorry, I considered it serious, but at the time it wasn't urgent, is what he said.
Was that guy's name Captain Richard Head? I mean, jeez. I don't want to do that for real, but like,
honest,
listen.
It's the Edmund Fitzgerald, and she's huge, and the 16-footer in those sort of swells is going to get annihilated. So I think that's where the concern was.
I mean, look, I understand that, and that's not what I guess I'm even trying to. But like, where's the professionalism of just going, this person just called in a mayday? Like, do you get to arbitrarily decide? Yeah, but I mean, it's like The Titanic. I mean, look, that happened. Okay, there's something you go put in your similar to Titanic things. I mean, that happened. The Cape Hatteras life-saving station, the weather station rather, picked up the distress call basically before anybody in the world picked it up. Radio New York, and the guys in New York were like, "Stop being drunk. Stop junking the lines. Get off the radio, jabronis."
Yeah.
But just my brain is sitting here going like, okay. That assessment of the ship's conditions in the water, whatever, that makes sense to me. But like, it sounds like he completely disregarded the Mayday.
It does appear that way, that they just figured, okay, well, there's a storm. It's really nasty out there. You can't see him on radar. It's just you've lost contact. I don't think anybody thought that the Fitzgerald could have gone down. And what
honestly,
makes it even more...
I'm sorry, Rich. What exactly could they have done? Like, the Coast Guard is not going to necessarily sally out in the midst of that storm to go try to find the Fitz.
That's exactly you make like Arnold and you got to the chopper.
Well, to that point, you're right. There's not much they could have done. In fact, the Coast Guard didn't have any vessels available, and all the other ships in the area, private or commercial, were moored up and trying to ride out the storm.
Right.
The Anderson tries the Coast Guard several more times. By 9:03, the Anderson's in Whitefish Bay. They make it. They're anchored up. The Coast Guard hails them and says, "Can you all go look for the Fitzgerald?"
What?
You said she was missing, right? Yeah, they asked Captain Cooper to take the Anderson back out to look for the Fitzgerald since it was not on radar and they had lost contact. And he's really reluctant. He doesn't want to go back out. He says, "I'm afraid if I go back out, there's going to be 2 ships on the bottom." But he agrees. He ultimately says, "Okay, I'm going to go back out." He's very skeptical, but he basically says, "Well, I'll give it a try. I'm not sure what I can do."
Are the Coast Guard resources, Rich, like deployed elsewhere, or are they just riding out the storm? Because don't they have this? Isn't one of the Coast Guard official or unofficial mottos like "We have to go out, we don't have to come back"?
Yeah.
So like are they just assisting, or are they just trying to ride this out? Because when you say like they don't have any ships available, like what are they doing?
Well, I can't really answer that exactly as far as what ships they had available.
All right.
I mean, if they had any ships that were deployed. I don't think that particular station had as many vessels as some of the other ones in the area, because ultimately what happened was they get some ships, some Coast Guard cutters, and even some aircraft from other stations nearby, but not that one at Whitefish Point. So, but I don't know exactly if they had vessels that were just doing other things, or if they just didn't want to risk them. I don't think that's the case.
Do we have any international involvement at this point? Where she's at in the water, she's got to be close enough to Canada. Is Canada involved in its radio communications and navigation at all? Or
actually, yeah, the Canadian Coast Guard jumps into it, and they provide aircraft reconnaissance. So they're joining the search. The Ontario Provincial Police are searching all along the eastern shore of the lake. So and the ship actually did go down in Canadian waters. It's close to the border, like right on the border. And they found a bunch of life jackets from the Edmund Fitzgerald. They found its 2 lifeboats. Both of them were badly damaged and bent and scraped up really badly.
On the surface, they found all these things?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The lifeboats were washed up on shore. One of them was torn apart pretty much, and the other one was really dented and banged up and scraped. So the lifeboats were really badly damaged. The life jackets they found, some of them were just pieces of them just torn to shreds. So it tells you the power of the storm and what it went through.
My God.
They found a piece of an inflatable life raft from the Fitzgerald. So they found all these remnants, but they couldn't find the ship. There were no survivors, and they didn't find any bodies. But they did search for 3 days. The U.S. Coast Guard, the Canadian Coast Guard, and the Ontario Provincial Police.
So Arthur Anderson, were they, when they were sent back out there to look, were they sent out for a specific amount of time, or was it just like you decide when to bring your ship back in after your look, after your search?
It was up to Captain Cooper. Yeah, he went back out. There really wasn't much he could do. And another ship named the William Clay Ford, as another cargo ship, arrived in the early morning hours the following day. So they did get a bunch of assistance, but there was nothing to find. The ship was on the bottom of the lake already. But they found all these remnants of things like the lifeboats and the life jackets. And it took a while too to a few days to actually find any evidence of the ship. They did a side scan sonar of the lake bottom, and they did actually find two large pieces on the lake bottom in the area that it was reported, about 170 feet away. They couldn't tell right at first if it was the Edmund Fitzgerald, but in May of 76, so that's 7 months later, they were able to positively identify it. The United States Navy sent a submersible down, and they found the ship. They were able to identify it, broken into two. The bow section is sitting upright in the mud. The stern is 170 feet away, but capsized. And all the debris of the iron ore pellets and things are scattered all over the place. And
I understand they
interestingly,
used some interesting tech to find her too. Not just the side screen sonar, but some of the technology was U.S. Navy for actually detecting submarines and things like that. Just
it
looking
was
for big chunks of metal in the water. It was a very clever idea to utilize that so quickly. And it surprised the heck out of me how fast they found her. Like you said, they speculated it was her, and then they were able to later confirm it.
Yeah, that's a good point. For the time, the 70s, and considering the conditions and the depth of the lake and the temperature of
Right.
the lake, they found it just within 7 months. That's pretty impressive for that time. They did have a pretty good idea of where it went down, but
Yeah.
nobody really knew for sure, and nobody really even knew why it went down. So yeah, the U.S. Navy came through and did that. And another explorer, that a private explorer named Fred Shannon, in 1994, so this is well after, went down to the Edmund Fitzgerald, and quite a bit, spent a lot of time down there, and he realized that the original charts were wrong, and that some of the Edmund Fitzgerald actually lied in U.S. waters, and some lied in Canadian waters. So they actually corrected the U.S. Canada border based on his data. So that was pretty interesting.
Canada was
But
probably really upset about that.
the bulk of it does still lie in Canada. In fact, the Ontario has they passed the Ontario Heritage Act that forbids anybody from exploring or salvaging the wreck without a license to do so.
Nice.
But some other,
With the wreck being located so quickly, was there any salvage done immediately, as far as, or any recovery of remains or anything like that? I know it's customary that if you go down, you typically stay down with the ship. But this was in a much more modern era, and so realistically soon after the event itself, was anybody brought home to the surface for their families?
no, actually, the Fred Shannon, who I mentioned earlier, he and his team actually did find one body on the Edmund Fitzgerald when they went down. It was a
Really?
crew member. Yeah, it was a crew member dressed in a life jacket and coveralls. Uh, they weren't able to identify who it was, and they did not recover the body. They left it in place, and just out of respect for the family and everything. But that one body is the only one that's ever been spotted. No other bodies or even evidence of anything has ever been found. Now, an interesting thing about the song, or in the local area, "The Lake Never Gives Up Her Dead," there's some science for the reason behind that, because the water's very cold, first of all, so it preserves the bodies. It's at that depth, it's very anaerobic, so there's no oxygen to contribute to any decay, and it slows composition and prevents gas from building up. Now, internally, when we have the gases build up, that's why they float to the surface. So
Right.
The legend of the lake never giving up her dead, this very well could be the reason for that. Just from a science standpoint, biology standpoint.
It was one of the coolest lyrics in the Lightfoot song. I'll tell you, when he said it, I was like, ooh, I was like, that's it's powerful. With all right, so I guess decision made then, and legislation passed to protect this site. How does this song? How does this song? I'm already ahead of myself. How does this story transition itself from tragic event to part of the North American? Because I can't just say American, because Lightfoot's Canadian, and Canada will riot if I try to claim him as an American. But it becomes such a piece of Americana, I guess, which technically I guess Canada can claim. I don't know. You should claim it, Canada. You're part of North America. But is it the song itself that puts it into the atmosphere of everybody's minds, or was this a national story just from the tragedy aspect? Like, was this a story that was in newspapers in, Maryland, where I grew up? Like, I'm sure in Michigan, in the Mitten, Matt, everyone in Michigan was probably freaking out about this, because it's probably, the biggest ship to go down in its history in quite some time, if not ever. But in Maryland, were people aware that this was occurring? In Hawaii?
It was a pretty big story. It did appear in newspapers. On the surface, you can say, well, it wasn't that bad. Only 29 people died. Well, that's true, but if you're a family member of those 29 people, it's a horrendous tragedy. And I think also the fame of the ship in the area, in the Great Lakes area, its popularity, that contributed to it as well. It was a very well loved ship. The people of that area loved seeing it. Like we talked about, the DJ captain and all of that. All that being said, it's my opinion that the fame of this story, how it became part of our consciousness, really is from the song, and I credit Gordon Lightfoot for that. Obviously, he was a mariner himself. He wrote another ballad about a shipwreck earlier in his career, actually, about the Yarmouth, and he heard the story on the news and wrote the song the next day, basically, and that was that. 1976, it was released. And
wow, that's really soon after the event.
Yeah. So it happened very quickly. Now I remember hearing that song. I think I'm a little older than you guys. I'm not sure, but
maybe me. Matt's pretty old. You'd be surprised. Matt qualifies for AARP already. He's not even old enough to do it. I don't know how that works.
Well, I was alive when this happened, although a young boy. I don't remember the incident, but I certainly remember hearing the song. And I've heard it so many times since, obviously. So it wasn't really until probably my 30s that I really thought about the song. I just thought it was some ship. I don't know. Some ship up north. I don't know what it was.
Right.
But when I really started to think about it and listen to the lyrics and what they meant, that's when it really started to hit me. And maybe it just took a little bit of maturity and wisdom to come to that point. So then, fast forward to me doing this podcast, all of those things really hit home, that this really is quite a story.
Yeah.
The lives of the people on board, and there's some other stories about some of the other crew members that I chose not to get into. It would have really gotten a little bit into the weeds had I done that, especially for a podcast. But on some of the documentaries on TV I've seen, they talk about the young crew members on board, and they just loved each other, and they were all such great friends and comrades, and all the way to some of the veteran seamen on board that, grizzled old salts, as you would say. But they all looked at each other as brothers in arms, and how much respect they had for each other. And I think there is something to be said too for the loss of those blue collar men, working class guys, just trying to make a living, trying to provide for their families at great sacrifice.
Right.
And to lose them like that is tragic.
Absolutely. That's the song is how I got to this story. And I grew up on rock and roll. I was very fortunate that, both my parents, you wouldn't think it now by looking at them, but they were rock and rollers once upon a time. So I had a healthy dose of a lot of singer songwriter, electric guitars, all this stuff. But every once in a while they would change it up and play some more folky, deep, soulful type music. And Gordon Lightfoot was a favorite of my parents. And I listened to this. I'll be honest, I was going to ask you if you can even name another Gordon Lightfoot song, because I cannot. But like in the process of thinking that thought, you were like, he wrote another song about the Yarmouth. And I was like, well, all right, too. But yeah, I know
Sundown.
Okay, I do know two. Then I'll say I know Sundown. Okay, I know two songs. All right, cool. Maybe most people know two songs, but our producer is a huge Gordon Lightfoot fan, and he went and saw him recently before the end of Gordon's life. He got to see him, I think, within the last 2 years of Gordon being on Earth with us, and he knew how much that I was into the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald and into the song, and you go to a concert, your friend's favorite song, you get like a 30-second clip on your phone, you send it to him. This man sent me the entire song. He's like, he just filmed the entire live rendition of Gordon Lightfoot performing, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And it was kind of bittersweet in a way, because you could tell Gordon was a much older man. And though we didn't know it at the time, that we were very close to the end for him, but it was interesting that you could hear like the experience of this, like Gordon, I think, took on the legacy of all 29 of those men and carried it for his life. Because
I think so.
I have seen several other clips of the same show our producer went to, and I will not throw shade at an old successful man, but that man was definitely in the twilight of things skill-wise, and we'll just leave it at that. He was blessed to live a very long life. Yeah. But cut to the track of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it was like that man transported himself back 50 years to when he wrote it. The energy, the power, the skill, the soul, it was like all there again. And I couldn't help but just feel that it's like, did you intend on taking on the legacy of 29 men and their families, like legacies? And like, but that's what happened. And that's how most of us came to the story, was through that. So, we said one of the things we were going to do in our production of this episode was we were going to play the 29 bell rings, just to end our episode, to honor, to pay our respects to the 29 men lost. But I think we agreed that we were going to ring the bell 30 times because Gordon more or less is a part of this story now. Like he is. It's weird. Like he's not a part of the tragedy, but he's a part of the memory and a part of the celebration. He is the memory.
Yeah.
And the celebration.
I love it. That's amazing, because most people would not know the story. The whole story would have been forgotten about by the bulk of the population, if not for the song that he wrote.
Right.
So I love that you're doing that.
That's awesome. Thank you. So moving into the sort of the aftermath, obviously they don't bring up any salvage. They don't bring up any of the remains. Does this wreck get tended to now? Obviously this happens in the 70s. I know in the 90s, there were certain expeditions down there. I think they went and recovered the bell at one point, replaced it with I guess what I'm understanding is the replacement bell is also simultaneously the tombstone, because it has all the men's name inscribed on it. But the only thing to come up is the bell. That happened in the 90s. Is there anything in the interim? Are people visiting the site? The families visiting the site? Is there any oversight, or, and then I'm going to ask the kind of the sad question. I mean, is it pirated? Like, I mean, is it ever a part of any sort of that stuff? Like, people do this with Titanic now, right? They'll pay for private dives and they'll bring back things they shouldn't bring back. Has the Edmund Fitzgerald been maintained and or pillaged? Maybe not the right word, but pilfered. I don't know.
The wreck is largely left alone. As far as I know, nobody has been pillaging it or taking souvenirs or anything like that. If they have, they certainly haven't made it known. I can't imagine anything from it would be advertised for sale or anything like that, because it would not be received well.
Right.
That's for sure.
The
laws
families
protecting
are
the wreck.
extremely protective of the memory of it too. There's 2 or 3 different museums that really feature the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the families are heavily involved with those museums. They're extremely protective of her memory. So I imagine if anything got brought up, they would be on top of it very quickly.
Yeah. Now, I have seen some artifacts from the Edmund Fitzgerald, but they were not taken from the wreck. They're things that were on the ship at some point prior, like plates and ashtrays and spoons and things like that have the symbol for the Ogilvy Norton company that operated it. But I think the wreck is largely respected and not tampered with. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Michigan is probably the biggest and best collection as far as having an exhibit about the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's quite impressive. I haven't seen it in person, but I've toured it through their online media. And there's some other ones too, like where the bow anchor was raised in Detroit. There's a little museum there that has some information about the Edmund Fitzgerald as well.
I'm sure its long-term preservation and memorialization plan is very different than, say, a ship like Titanic because of the freshwater component of the story. You know, Titanic, and I don't know how right they are, because I realized that right now I was getting ready to say, they say Titanic in 30 years will be completely dissolved into a rust puddle. But they said that 30 years ago as well, I realized. So, but I think what's undeniable there is that Titanic is, decomposing, right? It's being eaten alive. It's rusting away. Things happen at a much slower rate in the Great Lakes because it's freshwater. I mean, it's just as cold as where, say, Titanic and things like that, but it's freshwater, and that's a very different experience for a ship underwater over time. So is there a long-term plan for the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald? I mean, do the families ever, I guess I'm trying to, before we move into like any further thoughts on memorialization and winding down the show, like, is there a plan, or is it just to let that ship sit there and those men rest and we leave it at that, I guess? Is that the plan?
As far as I'm aware, and I've read a lot about it, there are no plans to do anything with the wreck. Just let it be, let it sit and rest in peace with the crew members on board. And that's it.
What about
even the parts such as the bell that you were mentioning, Rich, that got brought up? The family, again, I go back to this point, extremely protective of it. It was either the bell or another piece that was supposed to kind of go out on tour of other museums a few years back for one of the big anniversaries of the sinking. And I guess not everybody approved of it. And there was a lot of fighting between the museums and the families and things like that. And I think a lot of that program or project got scuttled because of the resistance.
I mean, the families were mixed on bringing the bell up. I remember in prepping, I was watching a documentary that was produced, and I mean, they had multiple family members discussing the bell coming up, and there were some. I remember one woman very vividly describing her thoughts as she didn't get to bring her husband home for burial, so she wanted this bell to come up. But then there were other family members who were like, "Don't bring anything up." like leave it all down there. So I mean, I can see what you're speaking to, Matt. I just didn't know if there was a plan for further physical memorialization, because at the end of the day, let's be real, like fundraising is a way to keep stories alive, museums funded and things like that. And I didn't know if there was any other plans for limited salvage of non I'm trying to speak very delicately because I know what's in my mind and I don't want to be disrespectful to anybody, but like there are things on that ship that are not directly related to the living, things that I guess could be seen in a museum in a certain context that I wouldn't view as outrageous. But then again, I didn't lose anybody on this ship. So I will leave that thought right there, because I just was wondering aloud if there were future preservation plans. But if it's good enough for the families to let the wreck be, it's good enough for me. I'll leave that at that. Rich, when you move away from this subject and you move it into your memory, do you leave it at the Lightfoot song? Do you have a special time? Like when you look at the research you did for your episode, obviously you were able to kind of look at how certain anniversaries of the wreck, certain public memorials were conducted and held. Do you live in the Lightfoot memory of the song, or do you have a much richer, no pun intended, Rich, take on of the story of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald?
Up until the point where I did this episode, I would say I largely just lived in the Gordon Lightfoot song. That was meaningful to me. Like I said, once I really understood what the song was saying, it meant a lot more to me. But after reading as much as I did for this podcast and listening to the radio chatter and hearing from some of the people that were on the Arthur M. Anderson, it's a lot more now. I feel like I have a much greater appreciation and understanding of the event, and what they must have gone through. Not that I would ever want to be in that situation, but I have a much greater understanding and appreciation for all of it. And when I hear the song now, I really understand the circumstances they were going through. So it really has helped me, like, put me into the situation in a way where I can really understand what they went through.
Beautiful, beautifully said. Yeah, the song definitely hits a lot harder for me, having a better understanding of the story now as well. And I do think beyond Gordon Lightfoot now, I think about the names of the men. I think about the experience and emotion of the bell coming to the surface, and yeah, things like that. So what we are going to do, if Rich, do you have any more thoughts on the Edmund Fitzgerald? Do you want to tell our listeners either your final thoughts on this story? You want to tell us a couple favorites that maybe your listeners should tune into on your show? Aside from absorbing your entire catalog, let's be real, everybody's got favorites.
Sure.
We love all of our episodes, but we got favorites. Do you have any more for the Edmund Fitzgerald? Or do you want to maybe tell our listeners a little bit about some of the other cool episodes you've touched on in your show there?
Well, as far as the Edmund Fitzgerald, I think we said everything there is to say. I really have a lot of respect for the families had gone through all of this, and I never want to make light of anything tragic like this. So that's again why I take it pretty seriously when I do my episodes. But as far as my other episodes, yeah, I've got quite a few, but some personal favorites of mine it's a 3-part series on the Batavia, which was a Dutch East India Company ship that ran aground and sank off the coast of Australia on a reef. And it absolutely goes bonkers after that. It's a story of murder and torture and greed, and basically one of the merchants creates his own little torture island. So it's quite a story.
Oh, I'm queuing it up right now. That
Yeah.
sounds grisly, Rich.
Yeah.
Gnarly.
It's 3 parts. It's long, but I was able to interview Dr. Howard Gray. He is from the Batavia Heritage Maritime Association, and he was absolutely fantastic. And I'm hoping to do another episode with him. Also, the Sultana. It's a 2-part series, and that was actually my first 2 that I ever did.
Yep.
And I interviewed author and historian Jerry Potter for that one, and that is also just an outrageous story. Steamboat on the Mississippi River killed about 1,500 Union soldiers. So, but I've done episodes on the Ender Doria, the Achille Lauro, some of the ones you may have heard about, the SS Arctic,
Yeah,
the RMS Republic. Time will tell whether I do the Titanic or not. I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you what, we would like to work with you on shipwrecks. Matt and I have kind of worked ourselves into like one shipwreck a year or every other year. We are just as known now for covering random shipwrecks as we are for being American Civil War and World War I geeks. I guess when you lead off with Titanic, you kind of set a tone, right? So we'd love to work with you again on another shipwreck story, because they are fascinating to us. It's not something that we are even remotely fluent in at all, but we're pleased to have made your acquaintance and privileged and honored to have had you on our show to tell this story. I thought you did a fantastic job telling the story on your channel, and I'm very grateful that you came onto ours and shared with our listeners the same experience. So I guess before we get out of here, we'll say this: if you have been enjoying the show for 5 years and you're looking to help out, as always, share it with a friend. Share it with your friend that likes shipwreck. Share it with your friend that likes military stories. Share it with your friend that likes music, because the History of Things podcast, and who likes food. We've covered all of these things through the lens of history here on the podcast. And make sure that you're leaving positive reviews and 5-star ratings on your favorite podcast apps. Speaking of podcast apps, Rich, social media and podcast apps, where can people download and follow Shipwrecks and Seadogs?
Yeah, I'm on all the different podcast apps, you name it. I'm on it at Shipwrecks and Seadogs podcast. And on social media, I'm at Shipwrecks Pod on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Mastodon, Spoutable, Tribal, and maybe one Threads now too.
Mastodon? Are you a Power Ranger? What did you just say? Mastodon? Are we not hip? I don't even know what that is.
I am not hip. Let me just say this. When Twitter was bought and seemed to kind of be crumbling, I said, well, because that's my main, I get more traffic from Twitter than I do everything else. So I was worried. So I kind of went with all these Twitter clones that were popping up, and I'm waiting to see which one might emerge from the ashes, if any. So
Mastodon.
But Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Shipwrecks Pod. Go to shipwrecksandseadogs.com for all the episodes and such, if you would like, or subscribe and listen on any podcast app.
And make sure you leave him 5-star ratings and positive reviews. And make sure you lift up the Shipwrecks and Seadogs podcast. It is one of my favorites. For those of you who know Inside Baseball, I do not listen to too many podcasts. I have to listen to my own so often in the editing process that I don't really want to listen to anything else. But I do listen to Shipwrecks and Seadogs and one other. If you know that one other, you're hip. But Rich, you are literally the only other podcast I listen to outside of a very ridiculous paranormal podcast. So,
thank you.
So it's been a great pleasure personally to have you on the show here, and we hope to have you back. Matt, what we've talked about doing here is ending our show with a small tribute, a humble tribute to the 29 Men. We came to this story through the musical artist Gordon Lightfoot, who has now himself passed into the beyond. What we are going to do is do our best to, in addition to telling their story, just say thanks to existing, and thanks to Gordon for being a part of this. So it is a tribute to the men of the Edmund Fitzgerald to ring the bell 29 times. When they raised the bell from the shipwreck itself, they rang it 29 times. I do believe at the museum there, the Shipwreck Museum in Michigan, they ring maybe not the same bell, but they ring a bell 29 times every year on the anniversary of the wreck. So we're going to close our show the same way. We don't want to invent something new. We want to do something that's just humble and respectful and right. So what we're going to do, though, is a little different. We're going to ring the bell 30 times because, Gordon, you are a part of this story, and we want to say thank you for bringing the lives of the Edmund Fitzgerald and its sailors to all of us and to all of you, our listeners. So for our guest today, Rich Napolitano, host of the Shipwrecks and Seadogs podcast, for my co-host, Matt Borders, I'm Pat McGuire saying thank you much for listening to the History Things podcast. As always, we'll see you all later.
Have a good night.